What if I told you that beneath the streets of Jerusalem, the Knights Templar uncovered something that should never have survived? Not gold, not relics, but words. Words that could tear Christianity apart. For 8 centuries, the Vatican has denied their existence. But fragments, whispers, and shadows tell a different story. Scrolls attributed not to Peter, Paul, or John, but to Mary, to Thomas, even to the Nazarene himself. If these forbidden gospels were real, they could change everything you thought you knew about faith, history, and power. Tonight we descend into that silence. And once you hear what was found, you may never look at the church or at the story of Christ the same way again. Are you ready to know what they tried to bury forever? They said the chamber was empty. That beneath the Jerusalem chapel there was nothing but centuries of dust, cobwebs, and discarded stone. But they were wrong, because behind a crumbling arch, beneath soot and silence that had smothered the earth for nearly a millennium, something was found. Something so fragile it should have dissolved long ago, yet so potent it could unmake the foundations of faith. A manuscript, leather-bound, cracked like old skin, ink faded but still breathing with the rhythm of words older than Latin. The script was forbidden not merely because of its content, but because no one even recognized it. A language too ancient, too intimate, written not in the polished cadence of Rome, nor the philosophical abstractions of Greece, but in something rawer, something closer to whispered memory. And the words it carried, they were not attributed to Paul, not Peter, not even John. They were attributed to Mary, to Thomas, to the Nazarene himself. It was not just another gospel, it was a gospel that should not exist. A text that could shatter the careful scaffolding of the church, tear doctrine apart like parchment in a storm. A gospel the Vatican for 8 centuries has tried to pretend was never written. But the Templars found it, and they did not destroy it, they read it. So the question is not whether the scrolls were real. The question is, what did they say? And why did they vanish just before the Inquisition came knocking? Take a breath. Let the silence settle. Imagine incense smoke curling up into the dome of a darkened chapel. Now listen carefully, because in that stillness, the kind of stillness that lingers only in crypts and catacombs, revelation waits. Jerusalem, late 12th century. Most people imagine the city then as holy, glowing in the soft serenity of stained glass hymns. But that is a lie painted centuries later. The real city trembled. It stank of conquest, empire, and prophecy. The Crusaders had seized it barely 2 decades earlier, and the smell of fire still clung to its air. And into this fractured landscape came the Knights Templar. Not as pilgrims, not as priests, but as tenants of something ancient. They were given quarters in the Al-Aqsa Mosque, which the Christian world called the Temple of Solomon. It was a symbolic gesture, but the Templars did not linger above ground. They went below. Why? That question haunts every historian. For 9 years, there is no official record of what the Templars did beneath the Temple Mount. No ledgers, no receipts. Just silence. But silence is never empty. Later travelers wrote hints. Arab chroniclers, Byzantine wanderers, even curious Benedictine monks. They spoke of midnight excavations of carts hauling away bundles wrapped not in armor but in waxed cloth. They described tunnels echoing with the sound of chisels, shafts deliberately reinforced for something more than storage. And then, in a forgotten charter, a single phrase appeared in Latin, scriptorum subterraneum, a scriptorium beneath the ground. That phrase has ignited centuries of debate. If true, it meant the Templars weren't just digging. They were copying, translating, preserving. Preserving what? The church says it was infrastructure, a drain, a storehouse, a stable. But fragments suggest otherwise. Ledgers hint at manuscripts written in dialects older than Rome. Some say Galilean Aramaic. Others whisper of Samaritan tongues. Words written by hands never canonized. Voices deliberately silenced. Voices that told of a gospel the church did not choose. And the Templars, they didn't just stumble on these texts. Some say they were looking for them. Others, more chillingly, suggest they were sent. Here's where the horror sets in. Not from ghosts or demons, but from words. Religions depend on stability. The Bible, the Quran, the Torah. These texts shape entire civilizations. If you alter even a phrase, you risk splintering faith itself. A gospel from Jesus that contradicts the New Testament. That's not just heresy, that's apocalypse for authority. So when whispers surfaced that the Templars had found other gospels, scrolls hidden beneath Jerusalem, scrolls that spoke with a voice less divine and more human, the Vatican had only one option: silence. But silence doesn't erase. It only hides. Centuries later, a British engineer named Charles Warren would descend into those same tunnels. He described shafts reinforced with stone, grooves cut for jars that once held parchment. In one cavity, his men found a clay vessel, broken but datable to the 1st century. Empty but suggestive. Coincidence? Or had the Templars come first, centuries earlier, and taken what lay inside? And then there was the monk, a Cistercian writing in 1178 who recorded the strange words of a Templar knight. The knight whispered of divine writings locked in stone below the mount. The monk dismissed it as fevered nonsense. Yet in his postscript, his tone changed. He spoke, the monk wrote, of a gospel that is not a gospel, of the woman who bore the word, not just the flesh. Did he mean Mary, the mother of Jesus, or Mary Magdalene? Either answer is a dagger. One makes her more than vessel, the other makes her something more dangerous still, successor. Imagine being that monk, hearing such a whisper in the dark. Awe, dread, I would feel fear. Because if true, it does not merely rewrite Christianity, it tears it apart. The Templars did not emerge from those tunnels carrying relics or gold. What they carried was far more dangerous. Words. The first whispers spoke of a text unlike any preserved in Rome, a gospel of the Nazarenes. This was not the polished Greek of the canonical four, but a rougher tongue, closer to the dust and firelight of Galilee. The sayings attributed to Jesus here were not the grand pronouncements of a divine figure, but riddles, sharp and strange, unsettling in their intimacy. One fragment preserved in the notes of Jerome centuries earlier described the Nazarene saying, "He who is near me is near the fire, and he who is far from me is far from the kingdom." That line is nowhere in Matthew, Mark, Luke, or John. Yet when Templar scribes copied a fragment in Galilean Aramaic centuries later, The phrasing was nearly identical. Coincidence? Or had they stumbled upon the same forbidden stream, carried underground while Rome canonized safer waters? This gospel stripped away miracles. No loaves and fishes, no walking on water. Instead, there were gnomic teachings, paradoxes, riddles, proverbs that burned like brands on the mind. Here was not a savior enthroned in heaven, but a teacher by a fire speaking softly to those who dared to listen. And therein lay the danger. For a god can be institutionalized, sculpted in stone, carved in glass. A god can be crowned and made the centerpiece of empire. But a teacher breeds questions. A teacher sparks rebellion, and rebellion whispered in parables is contagion. The fragments multiplied. Another gospel carried in secrecy among the Templar reliquaries was spoken of with both reverence and dread. The Mariamne Gospel. It was unlike anything in the canon. For here the voice was not Christ's, but Mary Magdalene's. She wrote not of miracles, but of memory, of laughter, of doubt, of long silences in which the man she knew was not Lord, but teacher. She never called him divine. She never called him Savior. She called him Rabboni, teacher. In her gospel there was no crucifixion, no resurrection, no empty tomb. Only departure. In one haunting passage she anointed him not as prophet preparing for death, but as king preparing for exile. Do you see the horror of it? The destabilizing power. This was not merely an alternative gospel. This was a correction, a counter-narrative, one in which intimacy replaced empire and memory replaced miracle. If canonized, it would have made Christianity ungovernable, but the whispers did not stop there. Some scrolls carried no enlightenment at all, only terror. Among them was one sealed in black wax, bound so tightly it could only be opened with knives. Its ink was not the usual brown iron gall, but something iridescent, shifting with the light. Those who dared to read it were never the same. One knight returned from Acre blind, another mute. A prior named Theobald of Lorraine was found upright in his cell, dead, eyes blackened, clutching a cloth on which a single word was written. Phos, light. But the word was inscribed upside down as though the page itself had twisted. In the margins of another Templar copyist, a warning was left in Latin. Non videat nisi purificus, let none gaze unless purified. They did not burn it. They did not dare. Instead, they built a reliquary of lead, sealed it with resin, and locked it with 3 keys. One in France, one in Cyprus, the third lost to time. Why preserve such a thing? Because even in terror, the Templars believed it was sacred. Their liturgical chants whispered of it obliquely, of the book that sees the reader. Not a book you read, but a book that reads you. Imagine the dread, a manuscript that does not simply contain words, but perceives. A gospel that reflects not history, but your own hidden thoughts. Other sayings attributed directly to the Nazarene shocked even seasoned scribes. One fragment read, "The door opens inward, and only the blind believe it locked." Another, "He who does not drink from his own well shall thirst forever, even at the river." And another more esoteric still, "When your left hand becomes your right, when your eye sees with the heart, then your shadow will walk ahead of you." These are not the words of an emperor god. They are the provocations of a mystic. No miracles, no power, only riddles that turn the self inside out. And therein lies the danger. A divine savior can be worshipped, but a mystic who teaches awakening cannot be controlled. For if Jesus was a teacher of inner revolution, a man urging men to see with the heart, then the scaffolding of Rome collapses. Authority dissolves, and that, more than heresy, is apocalypse. No wonder these sayings were buried, not because they were false, but because they were too true. Imagine the Templars, knights sworn to Christ, crawling through tunnels, pulling linen-wrapped manuscripts from stone cavities, reading words no bishop, no pope, no priest had dared preserve. What did they feel? Awe? Terror? A commander wrote in a private letter, "The scroll is fire, and it must be carried with gloves of humility." Another, more somber, warned, "This truth is not armor, but a wound." A wound, that is what the forbidden Gospels were. A wound in the body of Christendom. A wound that never healed, only bled quietly through centuries of silence. The Templars carried these scrolls across Europe, some to France, some to Portugal, some perhaps even into the Vatican itself. With each mile, each translation, each whispered recitation, the burden grew heavier. And soon, it began to fracture the order from within. For not every knight agreed on what to do with such truths. Some wanted to bury them. Some wanted to live them. Some wanted to silence them forever. And in that division, the seeds of betrayal were sown. Among the scrolls that the Templars whispered of, none was more dreaded than the one they called Veritas Sanguinis, the truth of the blood. It was unlike the other Gospels, for it contained no parables, no sermons, no miracles. Instead, it repeated a single name like a heartbeat pressed into parchment. Yosef bar Yeshua, Joseph, son of Jesus. The implication was terrifying, a continuation, a bloodline. If true, it shattered the entire edifice of Christianity. For the faith of Rome depends on absence, on the death, resurrection, and ascension of the Christ as a unique and final event. But a child meant continuity, not in spirit, but in flesh. If Christ had descendants, then salvation was not universal, but particular. Not an empire's possession, but a family's inheritance. And empires cannot tolerate rival blood. The fragments described not triumph, but burden. A family forced into exile, children hidden, teachings whispered not from pulpits, but from parent to child. A paleographer centuries later, studying a scorched scrap said to come from the Templar collections, recorded a chilling line. He carried the lamp in silence, as was the way of the chosen, and her blood carried the mark, but his blood bore the name. This was not proclamation, this was survival. The Templars treated the scroll with reverence. They did not call it blasphemous, they did not dismiss it as forgery. They called it holy. One master in Arles wrote that it was too explosive to copy and too holy to destroy. Notice the words, explosive, yet holy. Another commander warned, "It is a fire one must carry with gloves of humility." Yet another called it a wound, not armor. Clearly, whatever they had found, it was not easily dismissed. They trembled, yet they revered. Legends of hidden bloodlines were not new. The Merovingian dynasty in France was whispered to descend from a sacred family. Cathar hymns hinted at secret traditions. Eastern sects told of exiled heirs. But the Templar text was unique in its voice. It did not boast, it did not glorify. It whispered in fear. It spoke of hiding, of shadows, of names erased deliberately. This was not myth, but memory laced with dread. And here the horror deepens. For if there was a child, there was no way to erase the bloodline. It would spread quietly, invisibly, like roots beneath soil. Descendants could vanish into farmers, masons, soldiers, merchants, ordinary people carrying extraordinary inheritance in their veins. Imagine that. A Nazarene bloodline walking unknown among us, veiled by centuries of silence. The church could not erase such a thing, only suppress the whisper. And the Templars, burdened with this knowledge, became custodians of both sacred memory and heretical fire. But the burden fractured them. Letters preserved from the mid-13th century speak of councils where brothers argued fiercely. Some believed the scrolls should be sealed forever, hidden again beneath stone, never to surface. Others believed they were too holy to bury, that they must be taught, lived, embodied. One terrified scribe wrote of knights who pray without names, without saints, who speak the words of the Magdalene as if from memory. This is not the Christ I knew. This is a teacher who walks alone, division turned to betrayal. In southern France, whispers linger of a cloaked woman appearing in 1310 at 3 Commanderies. She carried a sealed scroll. She never spoke. The ledgers call her only La Porteuse, the bearer. Some believed she was a symbol, others that she was flesh and blood, the last visible guardian of a line already scattered. The phrase that recurs in those ledgers is ligne oubliée, the forgotten line, not forgotten by time, but forgotten by decree. By the dawn of the 14th century, Rome's suspicion of the Templars had reached fever pitch. Officially, the charges against them were absurd: spitting on the cross, obscene kisses, worshipping idols. But buried beneath these grotesque accusations was one charge more chilling than all: possession of heretical writings. Writings never produced at trial, writings never shown, and yet inquisitors spoke of them with fury, as though their absence itself proved their existence. One inquisitor, Etienne de Clermont, muttered in frustration during an interrogation. They knew we were coming, for when the king's men stormed the Paris temple, the vault where the scrolls were once kept was empty. Only incense ash covered the floor, spread deliberately. This was no accident. This was ritual cleansing. The scrolls had been moved, perhaps days before, perhaps years. Gone but not destroyed, because you cannot burn what you never find. This was the fatal wound. The order was torn, not by money nor by politics, but by truth too heavy to bear. A truth too dangerous to reveal, too sacred to destroy, too cursed to share. It bled the Templars from within, even before Philip III's purge and Clement IV's condemnation. The fire that consumed them did not come from the stake. It came from the knowledge they carried, knowledge that gnawed at their souls like a worm in fruit. Knowledge is light, or so we are told. But the Templars learned the darker truth. Some light blinds, some truth consumes. They guarded manuscripts that were no longer just forbidden, but feared. Cursed books whose words twisted flesh and spirit alike. Among them was one known as Liber Igneus, the Book of Fire. Not because it was burned, but because those who dared gaze upon it claimed the letters themselves glowed red like embers alive on parchment. Sir Hugo of Champagne, A knight of high standing reportedly opened it and read only 2 lines aloud before collapsing in convulsions so violent that 6 men could not restrain him. He never spoke again. His hand shook endlessly, clawing at his throat as though trying to rip the words back out. The manuscript was sealed in wax, bound in iron, and hidden away. Yet even in terror, they did not destroy it, for they feared it was not evil. They feared it was true. This is the paradox of forbidden knowledge. If a thing is false, you discard it, burn it, forget it. But if a thing is so true that it wounds the mind, then it becomes sacred, dangerous, untouchable. The Templars treated such texts not as blasphemy, but as relics. Dangerous relics, yes, but holy still. Imagine that. Hardened knights, who had no fear of sword or king, trembling as custodians of words they dared not read. Another scroll was spoken of in darker whispers still. Liber Speculi, the Book of the Mirror. Unlike other Gospels, its words could not be copied. Every attempt failed. Scribes fell sick, ink blurred into nonsense, parchment crumbled to powder. Those who stared too long at its pages reported something impossible. The letters began to shift, rearranging themselves into words they had not expected. Words that spoke not of Christ, but of the reader's own secret life, their hidden sins, their buried fears, their unspoken thoughts. One night recorded in horror, I turned the page and saw my own thought written there, though no ear had heard it. The book was not read. It read me. From that moment, the manuscript was sealed in iron and buried deep in a crypt at Laon. When inquisitors raided a century later, the chest was found, but it was empty, vanished. What terrifies more? The idea that it was destroyed, or that it survives still, waiting to gaze back at another soul. These were not metaphors to the Templars. They did not write as poets, but as men traumatized. A monk of Clairvaux recorded a knight named Bernard who returned from Acre with eyes empty of reason. For 7 years he wandered the abbey grounds, refusing bread, surviving only on water and herbs. He clawed scripture into the earth with his fingernails, the same line again and again. The light is a wound. The abbots thought him possessed, but the brothers whispered he had read one of the forbidden Gospels, one that spoke not of Christ the Savior, but Christ the mirror. Not the Christ who redeems you, but the Christ who exposes you. That is not comfort. That is horror. And perhaps the most chilling evidence is absence itself. Several priors left entire pages blank in their ledgers during the years 1185 to 1190. Nothing recorded, no notes of campaigns, no accounts of revenues, no names of brothers initiated. Only silence. And then at the bottom of one such page, faint as though breathed rather than inked, a single phrase in Latin, veritas tacit. The truth is silent. Why silence? Because silence was safer than description. To write was to risk infection, to let the word spread like contagion. Better to leave the page empty than to let another's eyes fall upon a truth that could consume them. This is the ultimate horror of the forbidden Gospels. Not demons, not witches, not specters, but silence itself. Silence heavy enough to suffocate centuries. The Templars discovered what philosophers later would call the curse of knowledge. Once you know a thing, you cannot unknow it, and sometimes knowing destroys you. The forbidden Gospels were not merely dangerous to the Church's doctrine. They were dangerous to the soul. They revealed a Jesus too human, too intimate, too radical. They revealed voices Rome had silenced, Mary's, Thomas's, a teacher instead of a god. And they revealed truths the mind could not absorb without breaking. A Christ who was not divine, a lineage of flesh, words that looked back at you and carved you open. The Knights carried these truths as wounds. Some buried them, some tried to spread them, some went mad. And in time, the order itself began to unravel, not from the outside, but from within, bleeding out from a wound no sword had inflicted. By the beginning of the 14th century, the burden of silence was already crushing the order. They had carried fire disguised as parchment, and that fire consumed them long before their enemies struck. Yet when the hammer finally fell, it came with terrifying precision. On Friday, October 13th, 1307, the king's men moved at dawn. Across France, Templar commanderies were stormed, brothers seized, leaders shackled, vaults broken open. The charges: heresy, blasphemy, idolatry. They spat on the cross, said the inquisitors. They kissed each other in obscenity. They worshipped a demon's head. But woven among the grotesque lies was one accusation that rang more chilling than the rest: possession of secret writings. Not relics, not treasures, not idols. Words. No scrolls were ever produced at trial. No parchment was laid before judge or pope. Yet the accusations persisted, like smoke without fire, unless the fire had been hidden away too well. One inquisitor, Etienne de Clermont, let his frustration slip during an interrogation. They knew we were coming. For when the vaults in Paris were opened, they were empty, not plundered in haste, but deliberately cleansed. Only ash covered the stone floor, spread carefully as though in ritual. It was not destruction, it was purification. Whatever had been there was gone. So where did the scrolls go? Some whispered that they had been ferried west, across the sea to Portugal, where King Denis offered shelter and rebirthed the remnants of the order, reforged as the Order of Christ. Others claimed they had gone north, carried into the wild hills of Scotland, hidden among masons and builders who would later call themselves Freemasons. Still others believed they were smuggled into the vaults of the Vatican itself, buried so deep that even inquisitors could not reach them. The Vatican's own ledgers feed the suspicion. For in the Archivum Secretum, the secret archives established soon after, one early entry baffles historians. It reads only, Liber Prohibitus T, the prohibited book of the Templars. No description, no shelf mark, no date of deposit, just a line and then silence. Why record it at all unless it existed? Why not erase it entirely? Because the Church is not merely an empire of power, it is an empire of memory. To destroy is to forget, and forgetting is weakness. Better to bury a thing alive, sealed in silence, than to risk its resurrection in rumor. And yet rumors multiplied. Survivors carried fragments. In Portugal, chronicles speak of a gospel of the woman delivered to Tomar. In Scotland, legends tell of a chest of manuscripts laid into the foundations of Rosslyn Chapel, sealed in stone, never to be opened. In the Languedoc, among the ruins of the Cathars, peasants whispered lullabies of "She who remembers shall guide the light." In Spain, an Inquisition ledger notes the confiscation of a manuscript called Evangelium Mariae, the Gospel of Mary, but records end abruptly with no trace of it reaching Rome. In Venice, a trader's journal mentions selling scripture in the tongue of Christ himself, carried by fleeing knights. These are not proofs. They are embers, faint and glowing in the ash of history. But sometimes embers tell us more than flame, because if the scrolls had been truly nothing, mere fantasy, why fear them? Why invent such elaborate silence? Silence itself becomes evidence. The louder the denial, the heavier the secret. And Rome did deny. Again and again, every accusation dismissed, every rumor labeled heresy. Yet the very need to deny betrays anxiety. For silence, unlike parchment, does not decay. Silence waits. By the mid-14th century, the Vatican's Archivum Secretum was already sealed against the world. Today, it is said to hold miles of shelves guarded from scholars and seekers alike. Most of it is bureaucratic. Letters, receipts, political reports. But somewhere within, so rumor insists, lie the forbidden Gospels. Perhaps the Nazarene fragments, perhaps Magdalene's voice, perhaps even Veritas Sanguinis. And perhaps worse, the cursed manuscripts, the Book of Fire, the Mirror Book, texts that read the soul. Former archivists deny it. Scholars scoff. But every few decades, a rumor escapes. In 1923, a Jesuit reportedly glimpsed a Hebrew gospel of the Magdalene. In 1945, after Nag Hammadi's codices were discovered in Egypt, Vatican scribes were dispatched to compare the finds with older holdings. Older than Nag Hammadi? What could those be? In 1979, an Italian journalist swore that a Vatican contact told him of a scroll that reads the soul sealed far below. All rumors, all whispers, but whispers have a way of outliving fire, and whispers spread faster than truth. The Templars had long since been reduced to ash and legend. Their leaders burned at the stake, their order dissolved. Yet the scrolls had not been destroyed, only scattered, hidden, carried west or buried deep. And from those fragments, from those rumors, from those silences, something stranger grew. The embers of the forbidden Gospels flared again. Not in cathedrals, but in lullabies, in folk songs, in secret lodges, in carved stones. Because even if the parchments themselves had been lost, the idea of them endured, and an idea is harder to kill than knights. The Vatican may have silenced the Templars, the stakes may have burned, the parchments may have vanished into ash, into vaults, or into the sea. But whispers are harder to kill than knights. And so the forbidden Gospels, even without parchment, survived in another form. Rumor. Rumor that took root in secret societies, in heretical sects, in guilds of stone and silence. Rumor that shaped Europe's underground imagination for centuries. When the Templars were dissolved, many survivors fled north. Scotland under Robert the Bruce offered them refuge. And in the centuries that followed, a new brotherhood arose. The Freemasons. Historians debate endlessly whether the Masons descend directly from Templars or from medieval guilds, but symbols tell their own story. The Masonic compass, the squared tools, the obsession with Solomon's temple, all echoes of Templar lore. Among their earliest rituals whispered in secrecy is one fragment that chills the spine. The light is not given but carried. That phrase appears nowhere in the Bible, yet it echoes a Templar chant about Christ as a lamp carried in silence. Coincidence or survival? Imagine a chain of whispers carried from knight to mason, from lodge to lodge, from ritual to ritual. Not whole gospels, not scrolls intact, but fragments. Sayings remembered, symbols carved, allegories disguised in stone. A living memory disguised as architecture. The forbidden gospels did not need parchment to survive. They needed only tongues and symbols. And in the mason's tools, the whispers lived on. Meanwhile, in the rugged hills of Languedoc, another ember glowed. The Cathars. They rejected Rome's authority, denied the crucifix, honored simplicity, and spoke of the beloved disciple without naming. But in their hymns, there are lines suspiciously close to Magdalene fragments. One chant begins, "She who remembers shall guide the light." Rome destroyed the Cathars in fire and blood, but fragments of their hymns survived in folk songs, in lullabies whispered to children. And what are lullabies if not the gentlest vessels for the most dangerous truths? In the mid-15th century, Rosslyn Chapel rose near Edinburgh. Its walls became a forest of symbols, angels, vines, cubes, stars. But hidden among them are carvings scholars still cannot explain. A column bears the image of a scroll bound in cord held by robed figures. Another shows a woman pressing a book to her chest, eyes closed in silence. Legends claim Rosslyn was the final resting place of a Templar chest, the reliquary once holding the cursed manuscripts. When renovators dug beneath the chapel in the 19th century, they found sealed chambers. They were ordered never to open them. To this day, they remain closed. What lies inside? Bones, treasure, or scrolls wrapped in linen? No one knows. And perhaps that is the point, for absence is sometimes more terrifying than presence. Fast forward to the 19th century. In the tiny French village of Rennes-le-Château, a poor parish priest named Béranger Saunière suddenly became impossibly wealthy. He had been repairing his church when, according to rumor, he found hidden documents in a hollow pillar. No one saw them. No one proved their existence. Yet overnight he became rich, commissioning strange renovations, carving cryptic inscriptions, erecting monuments that seemed designed to taunt. To this day, Rennes-le-Château is a magnet for seekers of forbidden gospels. Tourists trace their fingers along the stone, searching for passages, secret vaults, anything that might connect the village priest to the truth of the blood. Nothing has ever been proven. Yet the legend thrives because legends once lit are harder to extinguish than fire. And still the Vatican looms, silent as ever. Whispers insist fragments of the forbidden scrolls were smuggled into the Archivum Secretum, hidden beneath St. Peter's in chambers accessible only to the highest curators. Former officials deny it, scholars dismiss it, yet rumors slip through the cracks. In 1923, a Jesuit archivist supposedly glimpsed a Hebrew Gospel of the Magdalene. In 1945, after Nag Hammadi's codices were discovered, Vatican scribes rushed to compare them with older holdings. Older than Nag Hammadi, what could those be? In 1979, an Italian journalist swore he was told of a scroll that reads the soul, sealed far below in darkness. All rumors, all whispers. But silence once again is the loudest confession. And today, the forbidden gospels live not in stone jars or iron chests, but in words and books and films and digital echoes. From popular novels to whispered forums, the idea refuses to die. People hunger for the possibility that Christ was more human than divine, that Mary was more apostle than sinner, that blood still flows in veins descended from him. Is it myth? Likely. Is it dangerous? Absolutely. Because myths inspire more than facts ever could. That is the ultimate curse of the forbidden Gospels. Even if the parchments are gone, even if Rome burned them, even if no scrap survives, the idea remains. And ideas cannot be shackled, they cannot be tortured, they cannot be burned. Ideas survive. From Jerusalem's tunnels to Roslin's stones, from Cathar hymns to Masonic lodges, from Rennes-le-Château to Vatican vaults, the forbidden Gospels echo like a whisper that refuses to fade. But whispers once heard always lead to a question. What if they never vanished at all? What if they are still out there waiting not to be found, but to find you? The trail begins in Jerusalem, winds through Roslin, whispers in Rennes-le-Château, echoes in Tomar, fades in the Vatican's archives, and surfaces in fragments too fragile to name. And yet one thing remains constant: the silence. Because silence, unlike parchment, does not decay. Silence waits. For centuries, scholars spoke of a scroll no one had ever seen, referenced only in margins and coded maps. They called it the one-witness scroll. It was not Matthew, not Thomas, not Magdalene, not even the cursed Veritas Sanguinis. It was something else, a final account, written, they say, by the last disciple alive. Not fiery Peter, not philosophical Paul, not even beloved John. Someone quieter, someone forgotten. A witness who had nothing left to lose but memory. This voice wrote not for cathedrals, not for bishops, but for the hidden, for the keepers. The fragments that survive speak only this: he spoke words he would only speak once. What words? Instructions, a prophecy, a warning? No one knows. But every whisper agrees if the scroll exists, it could unmake everything. Knights who claimed to glimpse it spoke of visions. Monks who handled copies lost their minds. A scribe in Languedoc, before tearing his own eyes out, scrawled one line. The page looked back. What if this gospel was not written to be read, but to be experienced? Not ink on skin, but thought engraved in flesh. Some insist it was composed in riddles so raw they broke the mind. Others swear it was written not on parchment, but on human skin, a relic of terror that no fire could erase. The Vatican, if it truly lies in their vaults, will never release it. And perhaps that is mercy. But what if it is not lost? What if it never was? What if it survives not in archives or tombs, but in memory, embedded in rituals, etched in prayers, hidden in lullabies and symbols? After all, the Templars understood something Rome never did. Parchment burns, but memory walks. And memory is harder to kill than knights. Think of the evidence scattered like ash across centuries. The empty vault in Paris, the sealed chambers beneath Roslin, the vanished priest of Rennes, the Jesuit archivist who whispered on his deathbed, the scribe who saw a fragment misfiled as vellum sample. All of it points not to presence but to absence. And absence is its own kind of proof. If there was nothing, why such fear? Why such silence? Why such relentless denial? Because silence hides what cannot be confessed. One line from a Templar interrogation haunts more than any other. A broken man moments before death whispered, "The fire speaks," and we listened. Did he mean metaphor? Or something more literal? A gospel alive with flame, a voice that burned its way into those who dared hear. 3 days later, he was dead, his last words. The voice is not gone. It waits. And so we arrive here centuries later with nothing but whispers, fragments, rumors, silence. But silence itself whispers if you lean close enough. And maybe the last gospel was never meant for pulpits or cathedrals. Maybe it was meant only for those willing to risk silence, risk madness, risk remembering. So the question is not, did it exist? The question is, what if it still does? Perhaps it lies still in a vault, in a tomb, in a chest at the bottom of the sea. Perhaps it has crossed oceans, carried into a world unready to know it waits. Or perhaps, and this is the most unsettling thought, the last gospel is not hidden at all. Perhaps it is already inside you, waiting for the silence, waiting for the moment when breath halts, when thought slips, when memory stirs, waiting to be heard. And when that moment comes, when the silence opens, you will understand why they tried to bury it. Not because it was false, but because it was too true. The silence of the forbidden Gospels has lasted for centuries, but perhaps their echo reaches you tonight. What if the last scroll is not hidden in a vault, but waiting inside your memory? That is the question Rome could never silence, and now it's yours. If this story shook what you thought you knew, then share it. Let others hear the whispers too. Leave your thoughts in the comments below, because every voice added keeps the silence from winning. And don't forget to like and subscribe. The deeper we go, the darker the truths we uncover together.